Okay, welcome to Macroeconomics Hours, Sunday, December 10, 2023. Blood is off today, so you have to put up with me. Sorry. And the topic we decided to discuss for this session is China and Japan, what's happening, and the implications for the global economy. And I posted 5 articles, 3 of them about China, 2 about Japan. So just in case you want to follow up on this, please take a look. And if you have further readings that you want to add to this, that would be great. Now, any questions or comments before we start? All right. So what we're going to be doing is to look at what's happening in Japan and China, because they play significant roles in driving economic growth globally in the world economy. And there's some perception that growth is slowing down in these two countries, and probably in a number of other countries, but especially Europe seems to still be struggling. The US economy seems to be doing very well. It's still firing all cylinders, apparently. But Europe is in difficult situation. China and Japan have some problems, as we will see. And the question is whether this is going to continue, these problems, or are they going to bring down these economies or drive them into a recession, or these are temporary problems that are going to be solved very quickly. So we're going to look at what's happening in China, what's happening in Japan, and also what are the implications for the US economy and the rest of the world. And by the way, please interrupt me if you have any questions. Let's make this a two-way discussion, okay? So here's a recent trend in economic growth in China graph. And there are 2 lines here. One is year-on-year GDP growth, and then the lighter curve is the GDP growth from quarter to quarter. And we have the last quarter for which we have data is the summer, which is 1.3% over the previous quarter. For China, if this continues, and it seems that in the past 5 quarters or so, or 4 quarters, the growth rate has been declining or essentially flat, close to zero, or close to 1%. If this continues, we're going to have something like 4% growth in China. And for China, given that historically in the past few decades, it's been growing at rates well above 5%, growing at 4% may look weak, may not. So China may not be the engine that used to be. So we need to figure out what's happening. Why do we have this slow growth? Is it just a temporary phenomenon, or it's more long-term effects that is going on? And also, what are the reasons why the growth rates that we saw in the 2000s, 2010s, around 6 to 8%, that's not there anymore. And as you can see here, by the way, growth had been slowing down even before the pandemic. But since the pandemic, there was some instability and volatility of growth rate around the time of the pandemic. But now it seems that the volatility is out, and it's just the economy is not growing that fast anymore. We need to also look at inflation in this context. Inflation rate used to be relatively high. Of course, when by developing country standards, 5%, 6% is not very high. But for China, it was a bit high in the 2000s. It reached over 8%. But then overall, inflation has been going down. And what is very interesting recently is that we have entered negative territory lately. China has been experiencing in the past few months in deflation, negative inflation. And that's very significant matter because if prices go down, people tend to postpone their purchases because if you just hold on to your money, it becomes stronger. It can buy more goods. And if people do that and businesses do that, postpone their investments, postpone their purchases, etc., what will happen is that demand goes down and the economy slows down and eventually can enter a recession. So that's why deflation is pretty dangerous territory. And policymakers, people outside China also are very concerned about this trend. Okay, so this was the title of Wall Street Journal's article yesterday that said China can't shake deflation. It continues to experience deflation, and we need to figure out what's the source of this deflation. How did this come about? So, how did China get here? Let me go back a little bit, a few decades. Development strategy of China, economic development strategy, had been export promotion. This was what happened after they started reforming in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and they shifted towards an export promotion strategy, which is pretty much similar in many ways to what Japan had done, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, etc. in East Asia had followed this strategy and had gotten good results. So they started policy reform in the 90s. They also sharply devalued yuan, their currency, to make their goods very cheap abroad. And they also developed infrastructure to facilitate exports. So these were what they did, and the infrastructure development itself created a lot of demand for goods and services in China, and as a result contributed to economic growth at the time. So this was the reason for, or the environment in which China in the 1990s and 2000s experienced growth rates of 10% plus. But export promotion has diminishing returns because if you keep exporting more and more, foreign markets become saturated, finding new customers, more export opportunities becomes more and more difficult, and you need to figure out what to do next. And this problem showed itself most vividly at the time of financial crisis, global financial crisis, during 2008, 2009, and afterwards. China was facing stagnating foreign markets. US economy was not growing that much. And as a result, the opportunity to export was more limited. At that time, policymakers switched to other strategies. They needed to do a couple of things. One is find a new source of demand for their goods and services. And also they needed to make sure they prevent real exchange appreciation. What do I mean by that? The price of Chinese goods abroad in real terms, meaning that the price that they could get abroad relative to the price domestically, that needed to be prevented from appreciating. It was appreciating because cost of production in China was going up. As China was developing, wages were going up, markets becoming tighter in China, cost of production was going up, and as a result, prices in China were rising, and the price that Chinese firms could get for their products in international markets was not going up similarly. And as a result, foreign price relative to the domestic cost was declining, domestic cost was rising relative to foreign price, and that's called real exchange appreciation. And the problem that that poses is that it reduces profitability of exports, or if Chinese firms raise their dollar prices outside their country, that they lose competitiveness, and as a result, no longer they can export as much. So what the government did in response to this situation is they continued investing and expanding their production capacity to prevent cost of production from going up. So they had excess capacity to make it very cheap to produce, continue exporting, and also investment itself created demand for a lot of goods and services produced in the country. For example, think about building houses or apartment buildings. That lowers the cost of rents, that lowers the cost of housing, which helps keep the cost of production generally in the country low. And at the same time, you create a lot of demand for cement, for steel, for refrigerators, for a lot of other household items or business items that is going to be located or going to be using the buildings, using the apartments or buildings that are being built. So this was their strategy. Continue with infrastructure development, but housing was a big chunk of their strategy to expand housing, expand construction to make it cheap to produce. Also, they invested in technology, of course, and that also was supposed to help them keep their production costs lower. But capacity creation itself also has diminishing returns. Initially, when you invest, if there's a shortage of housing, if there's shortage of infrastructure, the returns could be very high. But when you've done a lot of projects, what to do next? And that's the problem that China started facing in the 2015 or 2014 and later. And their strategy since then was to promote domestic consumption and turn it into a driver of economic growth for the country. They had room and they could do it because domestic consumption in China is a fraction of total output. In fact, it's in the order of about 40%. So there's a lot of room to increase consumption and increase economic growth for quite some time. But then came some problems that the past policies caught up with what the government was doing. So what was happening? So let me actually show you some graphs before going through the analysis any further. So here's private consumption as percentage of GDP in China. It used to be relatively high, about 60-70%, but that's 60 years ago. Ever since 1970s, for a while, private consumption was about 50% of GDP, and lately it's been around 40%, even below 40%. That's what I mean, that there's room to increase domestic consumption to help economic growth continue if other factors do not interfere. By way of comparison, think about it this way. In the US, private consumption is about 70%, between 65 to 70% of GDP. So if they move towards a pattern of consumption similar to the US, there's going to be an enormous increase in demand for goods and services that consumers could demand, and therefore once consumer demand goes up, then demand for investment may go up, demand for government services may go up, and that those things themselves are going to drive economic growth for quite some time. Now, investment had been going up, especially as the country switched to export promotion. But I mentioned to you that they used investment strategy for a while in order to keep up demand when exports stagnated in the 2010s. But that really can't go on for very long. And this in China, about 43% of GDP gets invested. That's a huge amount of investment. This is rare in developing countries. In East Asia, some countries have done it, but this is relatively rare outside East Asia. And even in East Asia nowadays, this is not common. In China continues to invest tremendous amounts. And the problem it causes is that if the investment does not generate goods and services that are sold in the market and bring profits, then the funding that has gone into that investment, that financing needs to be dealt with. Either the government has borrowed and invested, or the private sector has borrowed and invested. And if there's not enough demand out there, and there seems to be the problem, the case because we have deflation coming, all that investment is not generating a whole lot of return, and as a result, the government is going to be facing a problem. The households, businesses are going to be facing problems of debt overhang, or what we call debt overhang, the debt that they had raised or the money they had put into investment, and now they have to pay back. Exports in China, this is the export promotion phase before mid 2000s. That's the export promotion phase. You can see exports as share of GDP went up very sharply from very low levels. And ever since the global financial crisis, 2009, 2010, exports have gone down. Nowadays, the trend is relatively flat. But that's not really a major driver of economic growth in China anymore. In fact, if you look at net exports, they've been pretty low and rather close to zero. And it's really net exports that has growth effects. Government consumption is an alternative source of economic growth, but government consumption in China has been pretty much flat over the past 2 decades, or 2.5 decades. And lately, in 2001, in fact, government consumption went down a bit, but that could be put up or increased. The problem is that the government had put a lot of its credibility behind government-owned firms or enterprises that borrowed heavily to invest or for example, invest in factories, invest in buildings, etc. And all that debt somehow really ultimately belongs to the government. And even the debt that is raised by the private sector and they can't pay back, the government may end up being responsible for taking care of those as well. And that's why government really is in difficult position to spend more to stimulate the economy. That's why right now there's a lot of concern that given that households, businesses are constrained by the past debt, and the government itself also facing a fiscal tightness because of the past debt, there's not going to be a whole lot of growth in demand in China, and that could reduce the rate of growth of China way below 5%. That nowadays seems to be the norm that the government is targeting, but that may not be something that they can reach anymore. Okay, so in the middle of all this, the government, especially under Xi Jinping has decided that there's need for some redistribution. Some private enterprise leaders seem to be too assertive and not really taking a whole lot of orders from the government as they used to do in the past. Because some of them became very rich, they asserted themselves, and the government was a bit anxious to make sure that they're put in their place or in their places. And that's where the ideological and political anxieties came up in the past several years. And the president of China has been trying to come up with ways of doing two things. One is to put these private capital owners who might become too self-confident in their places, and also make sure that income distribution doesn't become too bad, so it does not cause any social disturbances or political disturbances coming from the poor or from middle classes. So the redistribution has become a concern or part of the government policy. And also there's, as I mentioned, there's a problem of keeping the private sector leaders in their places and preventing them from becoming too assertive. These concerns have driven away a lot of investment out of China, and also more experts are leaving the country, establishing their businesses in Singapore, for example, or elsewhere. And there's also tension with the US that causes this movement. So in this context, the reason why we have deflation, one of them is that we have reduction in demand because of the debt overhang, and also the problems of some companies taking their capital outside the country. There's, at the same time, remember that the government was trying to push capacity creation in a very strong way in order to keep up the economy growing, keep the economy growing, and continue economic growth in the country. Putting these two sides together, demand has slowed down. There's a lot of investment that has come to fruition, like housing, and as a result, prices slow down and in fact are falling. And in that context, now we have deflation. And deflation itself is causing further problem because households look at their wealth when they want to spend, because wealth matters for their expenditure. If house prices go down, household expenditure also goes down. Deflation itself also may cause reduced demand. People postpone their expenditures, as I mentioned earlier, when they see that prices are going down. If you have some money and you think prices are going to be lower next year or next month, some items that you don't need to buy immediately, you may decide to invest, to buy later. Or if you want to invest, you might think that it would be cheaper to invest if you just wait a couple of months or 6 months or so. And as a result, immediately demand goes down and the economy shrinks, and that also causes inflation to go down, become more negative. Deflation rises, becomes a bigger problem, and exacerbates the postponement of expenditure, which in turn then reduces GDP, reduces income of people who used to work, and could lead to economic recession or major slowdown. So the declining prices, declining house prices, jointly are reducing wealth, sense of wealthiness, and and lower wealth reduces consumption, postponement of expenditure itself reduces demand, and jointly they all reduce income growth, which in turn leads to economic slowdown in China. So that's the current situation. And keep in mind also that a big chunk of household wealth is in the form of real estate. So when real estate prices go down, households feel less wealthy, and less people who feel less wealthy spend less. Lower property values also have reduced local government revenues in China because land sales, issuing permits, etc., have become less common and also bring less money to local governments. So local governments have difficulty financing their expenditures, and as a result, if they spend less, that's another source of reduced demand for the country. Meanwhile, the government of China has control over major banks. The four largest banks in China belong to the government, and that's been part of government's strategy to direct the economy, to direct finances towards investment projects that they prefer. But that also means that if there's a debt crisis, consumers, households, or businesses can't pay back their debts, a lot of it is going to fall onto government's hand. Either the company, for example, is government owned, and because of that, the government has to take care of the debt, or the debt is but it's borrowed by the private company, but the private company has borrowed it from a government bank, and the government bank, now not receiving the debt service, may not be able to maintain its balance sheet, and as a result, the government will have to come in and help the bank, which then could lead to fiscal crisis because the government itself has a huge amount of debt. All right, now let me take your questions and comments on what we've said so far. Any of you want to say something about what we've discussed?
If I may say, Professor Hadi, that I think the GDP plot was very insightful. Especially looking at the data, I'm hearing a number of things from different macroeconomists, but I think data itself speak for itself, right? I wonder that, looking at their two, big strategies, right? Like the export and then now the internal investment, and both of them seems to have paid off, whatever it is. Seems not picking up, right, as you explained.
Right.
I wonder that what options do you see for China now, actually, in the coming days? Are they thinking about any other long-term strategy? If you could explain, kind of,
Sure.
light on that would be
Getting some
helpful.
sun in my face, so let me get this down. Okay. Now, what they could do is they need to deal with this debt overhang, number one. How they can do it is that they need to create some inflation. So that could be done in different ways. One is to have the central bank print a lot more money and let the prices sort of stimulate prices. The other thing, policies that they have been following but not strongly enough, is to make sure there's more redistribution. Wages go up, and that raises cost of production, that produces inflation that way, and that could lower the debt burden. And once the debt burden is lower, then it can actually, the government and households with higher incomes can spend more, and the shift towards domestic sources of demand versus foreign sources like net exports, that shift is going to become complete. And it seems to me that China has room for increasing consumption tremendously. It's just a matter of handling this debt overhang that they've generated. This was partly a sort of bad luck, because what happened during the pandemic was that they suddenly they had created a lot of this capacity, but the pandemic reduced incomes, created a lot of uncertainty in the economy, and people became more cautious. They were spending less, so that lowered demand, and suddenly a lot of that expenditure, that investment that had been done in the past, looked superfluous, looked like too much investment.
I see.
Of course, one could argue that they did invest too much, given the risks involved. So if they had not done it, it would have been better. But that's something that one could argue either way. And that maybe because a big part of their strategy all the last 20, 30 years has been to make sure production capacity increases, so that when they stimulate demand, whether it's foreign demand or domestic demand, it doesn't create too much inflation. It's just that recently they have hit a particular constellation of factors that production capacity has come online, but demand is not there.
Right, right. And if I may clarify one more point regarding the personal consumption, right? You talked about it. It has gone down. I mean, is one child policy also has played a role, that there is a transition between China trying to bring people from rural areas to urban areas since long time. So one question that I have, if you could comment on it, is why really have these personal consumption has gone down? Are there other reasons? And second is that, is there any way China could increase that personal consumption moving forward? Is it even possible?
It's possible they should have probably started this earlier to make sure wages go up faster, salaries go up faster, and that gives households more income to spend.
I see.
Really something what they need to do. The China also suffers from a couple of other problems. One is that government controls have really paid off. The government controlling some state-owned enterprises, banks, etc., has enabled them to create an environment in which even the private sector in the past used to be very welcomed or felt welcome. And so private sector activity was growing very rapidly, despite the fact the government was so extensively intervening in the economy. But that has now backfired. The government has become responsible for everything. Right in the middle of this, the relationship with the US is deteriorating. Right in the middle of this, the president of China decides that the economy has gone too far towards liberal capitalism, and therefore some controls on businesses or some regulations. Some of them are not even regulations. They just try to embarrass the multi-billionaires in the country. And that has all come together to make it difficult to do business and to create demand in China.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see. I also had, let me go back to Okay. Just a second. Okay. So now there are some other problems that I think it's worth discussing, especially in terms of long-term considerations. One is that there's diminishing return to catch-up capital that has been the driver of China's rapid economic growth. So what happened in 1970s, 1980s was that China was extremely poor and technologically backward. So they could absorb a lot of new technologies if they invested a lot and help them raise their incomes. That was the key to the increase in their economic growth. The technology was out there, they could bring in, markets were opening for them at the time in the 80s, with the relationship with the US in the 80s and 90s improving. So they had foreign markets, they had also the cheap labor force to produce goods and export them. All they need, and there was technology out there, so all they needed was to create an environment to generate a lot of capital and investment. But that process, which helps the economy grow very fast for a while, eventually becomes problematic because there's diminishing return to this type of capital. But eventually you catch up, you reach a certain level of investment that further investment doesn't really bring you a whole lot of money. And this is not China, it's every country that follows this strategy of investment experiences this. Let me show you a graph that I had shown in some previous sessions and may actually shed some light on this point. So I think some of you may have seen this that I discussed in the past. This is per capita income in the US in constant 2017 prices. And if you look at Europe, put together all the 12 Western European countries, major economies of the Western Europe, and that's been moving parallel to the US almost. There are cases like Europe after World War II. During World War II, a lot of capital was destroyed. So growth rate in Europe after World War II was faster than the US. That's catch-up capital. They had lost some capital and they just reinvested and got it all. They recovered from that decline. Japan was also had been moving more or less parallel to the US and Europe in the 1980s, 1990s. But if you can see again, after World War II, they had experienced a very sharp drop in their income, and they again invested and grew very rapidly between 1950 and 1970. So that's again catch-up capital. I'm going to come back to Japan's case in a moment, but for now, let me go show you the average of developing countries. This is average per capita income in developing countries from 1950 to 2001. And as you can see, there's more or less sort of straight trend. Sometimes it has become a bit faster, like in the 2000s. And that was largely due to China growing very fast, but some other developing countries also were growing fast, and also India. Now, here's China's growth. And you can see that China was pretty much stagnating until 1970 and even up to mid-70s. Growth really started taking off around 1975 and then continued until recently. But notice here that similar to case of Japan or Western Europe, that they catch up, and once they get closer to the US, the growth rate slows down. That's also what's happening in China. To show you sort of a country that is one step ahead of China, Korea, it confirms what's happening here. You can see here that Korea changed its development strategy and started growing fast in the 60s. And grew quite rapidly with very little cases of stagnation for maybe 1 year or two in the 70s or 1990s, etc. But it has been growing quite rapidly and getting closer and closer to the US and Western Europe. But as it gets closer, its growth slows down because the catch-up capital is no longer working. All they need to do, all the growth comes in these cases, like the US, Europe, and Korea. Growth comes from technological change, new technology, producing more with the same resources, getting more out of your assets. That is how you grow long term. And that US has, for a long time, being the leader in technology, being leader in the world economy, has been growing based on its technological innovation and new technologies. Developing countries that had fallen behind, given that there was Korea, India, China, given that there was technology to adopt, given that there were opportunities for investment, they did so. But once that investment is done, their growth is going to be exactly the same as their technological advance. So let me go back here to the discussion here about China. So diminishing returns to catch up capital is slowing economic growth in all developing countries, and in China, I think in the next 10 years, growth is very unlikely to be beyond 5%. Most likely it's going to be between 4 and 5%. They still have some catch up to do, but because they're still far behind Korea. Korea's GDP per capita is twice as much as China's. And so they have some room for growth. But after that, they're going to be basically be growing at the rate at which they can have technological innovation and productivity improvement. And that's historically has been about 2% or so, 2 to 3%. 2% probably productivity growth, per capita income growth, and 1% globally, it's been about 1% population growth. So we've had 3% GDP growth altogether. But in case of China, and as is the case also in Japan and Europe as well, population growth also has stopped. There's been sharp decline in fertility. This goes way beyond what the government of China has been doing, one-child policy, etc., that they implemented to slow down their population growth. But now they're facing a situation where households don't want to have a whole lot of kids. And some households don't want to have kids at all. And as a result, we have negative population growth and soon we're going to be facing high dependency ratios. Dependency ratio is the number of elderly and children that have to be taken care of by people who are in their economically active years. So that's high dependency ratio. That's dependency ratio. And high dependency ratio because the cohort that is middle-aged right now in their 50s, even 60s, sooner or later they're going to retire and they will need the support of people who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s, and that ratio is going to rise, the retirees relative to producers, and that's going to create a whole lot of problems. Population decline, in addition, creates problems of its own. Just think about this. Right now, China has more houses than the population is demanding. Now, if population declines, there's going to be a bigger surplus of housing. House prices are going to go down. That's going to reduce investment in housing. That's a big chunk of GDP in China. It's going to shrink. That's going to be reduction in demand for household items and durables, refrigerators, cars, a lot of other products. So we're going to see a decline in demand even before it happens, because right now people are looking into the future and saying, oh, in 10 years, we're going to have excess housing. So now nobody's going to be willing to pay as much for housing as they used to. In the US and Canada and some other countries, this problem has been solved via immigration. But for China, this is not much of an option. And in a moment, when we talk about Japan, that's also a problem over there. Their politics does not quite allow open, easy immigration as has been the case in the US and Canada. And notice that in US and Canada, house prices have gone up quite a bit, especially in Canada. A lot of it was driven by their immigration policy. Okay, let me see if you have further questions here. So that finishes our discussion of China. Any one of you want to comment on what's happening and what you think?
I have a comment, but I want to ask others if they want to say something before I.
Sure.
Professor,
Yeah, hi.
Hi, go ahead, please.
It's okay. Should I go first, or I heard another voice?
Go ahead, please.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Vivian.
Thank you. So it sounds like a lot of activities that we discussed here are based on the assumption that China has been operating under capital market, and so to see the growth in something like that. For some reason, I mean, we all know that there's a huge amount of the policies or capital economic development and activities are intervened heavily by the government. So I wonder how that has been calculated or being considered in all the analysis of past activities. And then the second question I have is, you looked at the future considerations, that which you look at a chart, like every country seems quite similar. There's a pattern, right? And then, so how China is different from other countries then? Because as I mentioned, that there's a huge a huge role that the government plays in everything.
Well, China has similarities and differences with other countries. First of all, government intervention, that's a fact of life in China. Finance is dominated by China. All major banks are government owned, especially the four biggest banks that do most of lending, collect most of deposits that are government owned. And state-owned enterprises still play a key role in Chinese economy, and even private sector is easily manipulated and influenced. Whenever the government wants to do something, just think about what happened to Jack Ma, right? You don't hear from him anymore. Once the government felt that he's speaking too much and he thinks of himself as somebody who can be influential, they clip his wings, right? So that's fact of life in China, and that, in fact, in this analysis, we took that's taken into account. Now, the numbers that the government puts up for economic growth, economists have sometimes disputed. But the fact that China has been growing at very high rates compared to other countries. That is undeniable. Because you look at the standard of living, you look at the use of electricity, you look at the use of energy, you look at the amount of imports, you look at demand for some goods and services produced in China, like cell phones, for example. It's just been enormous. And income levels for all Chinese has gone up. It's just, of course, not evenly. People at the top, some people have gotten a much bigger share of the pie than others. But the fact that the average industrial worker in China now gets a bigger, much more real income compared to the previous generation, that's hard to deny. So I hope.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just wondering, like, how, we were looking into China and thinking about its future, things like that. And then it's kind of hard to apply the general economic rules or understanding that we have, because the government intervention, it's kind of make things so unpredictable, right?
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, so that's kind of like, I look at the numbers, I look at the data, and then always have this thing in the back of my mind that, maybe this is gonna work out in other places, but in China, there's a different story. You can really not.
Right. For example, the backlash or the change in government's approach to business that happened in the past several years under Xi Jinping. It was not predictable. You're right. Nobody could, 10 years ago, nobody could sit down and say that, well, in China, there's going to be much more intervention and all these billionaires are going to be stripped of some of their assets, etc.
And that actually kind of relate to what we discussed last time about India. People were talking about India taking over China in terms of its growth because of a huge population and things like that, right? And then I've heard people saying that, yeah, maybe that's true, but the time and place and the government intervention is just hugely different between the two countries, right? So India would never be able to become another China in that perspective because of that. Yeah. So anyway, I've just kind of share my thoughts based on
that's good. Thank you for the comments. And you're right that there are uncertainties that one needs to take into account, and in fact, or just accept that there's some things that we cannot know. But in some ways, it seems that in the past few decades, China has also defined a character for itself, that based on that, maybe we can think about what might happen next. One is, it's possible that pragmatism could come back.
I hope so.
It has happened in the past, and that could come back. One should not underestimate the spirit of pragmatism that dominates Chinese culture and politics.
Agree. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Professor, this goes right into the Japan conversation, but when you're talking about it, could you speak a little bit about, is there a way to maintain an economy if without growth, right? So if we're seeing population falls in Japan and in most of Western countries, like there's going to be less growth in the future or possibly flat growth, and can you still maintain a certain quality of life or with no growth?
You can maintain a quality of life without growth, but you can't improve it. And the fact of the matter is that human needs are endless. So we really need to keep up the improvement. For example, think about medicine, for example, or healthcare. We really need to make sure that the procedures, diagnosis, treatments for cancer continue to improve. And they have improved in the past few decades, and we really have a long way to go to solve those problems. So we need to have better medicine, better procedures, better diagnosis, etc. That's just one example. In many ways, we want to improve things for ourselves, for the society, for ourselves. Now, stagnation, I don't think is going to happen in the near future or the next few decades, because there's a lot of innovation that is going on, and we sometimes come up with new technologies that help the economy make it jump. It's possible that, for example, artificial intelligence right now is doing that, is preparing the economy for another leap forward. So those things are going to continue. And even if we, for example, in the cases like in Japan or Europe or in China, economic growth slows down or moves towards stagnation, and that could affect the whole world. Still, the technological improvement is going to come about and help raise per capita incomes. Standard of living, the quality of life can improve. Of course, we might also do pretty stupid things like have a global war, another world war that destroys a lot of lives and destroys a lot of things that we have right now. But assuming that we are reasonable enough not to get into that situation, then we should expect economic growth to continue. It's just not going to be as fast as it used to be.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, any other comment before we go? So shall we go to the case of...
Just one point, if I wanted to make the biased opinion. So I was recently hearing Professor Raghuram Rajan, right, who was a farmer. And one thing he said, something that just clicked with me. He said, if you take a look at the history and the economic growth in the countries, you will see the trigger of change and the high impact of it is pretty much in the autocratic environment. So when you were showing the previous plot, I was thinking about what he said, right? So if you take a look at the US and Europe kind of growth, the rate of change is not as high as something in China or in Japan, right? And I was trying to connect to his point about that initially the society has to be a little bit autocratic to get everything right, and before you start talking about human rights and so on. So the point I want to make, Professor Hadi, here, just on the record, if there is potential in generative AI, if it is true, then I think China is the only country I believe could trigger that high change than possibly any other country kind of moving forward. And to me, that seems that one of the key saviors for China. Again, you could be wrong, right, about our prediction.
Right.
But my point is that China still has this element of autocracy. And this is something which could potentially have a profound impact on people's life, as you were talking about, generative AI. And they are in a really good position to really trigger that change, unlike US and Europe, where I think we'll go through the human rights and other discussions moving forward. So just wanted to add this point.
Good points, although let me sort of throw in some caution. One is that there are a lot of dictatorships that do really poorly. You don't need to go very far. Just look at some other parts of Africa, parts of West Asia, look at Latin America. Dictatorships don't always do wonders. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. In fact, volatility is much more under dictatorships. So that's the second thing is that just think about China and AI. One of the first things they used it for was to identify faces and make sure that their dictatorship is more firmly in place, right? And that could lead to crazy ideas, crazy things. If Stalin had the same kind of technology that Chinese have right now, God knows how many more he might have killed.
Thank you. I think it's complete. It makes sense because I didn't want to be one-sided. My only point was this inflection point of the rate of change.
That's a good point. And that graph also, there was also mentioned, I think Vivian mentioned that there was similarities. Not all countries actually experience that. Let me bring that graph again. Okay. Not all the countries that I have here, of course, let's see. Okay. US and Western Europe have been developing in parallel. Japan also did the same thing, although there was this catch-up period that was really rapid. Now, developing countries on average have been growing, and we have these cases of Korea and China that it looks as if they have been moving in parallel, in tandem, towards higher income. But if I show you the graphs for example, Middle Eastern countries or African countries, you wouldn't see necessarily this pattern. In some of them, temporarily you might see, but they have a lot more volatility. What happened in Korea or China is actually relatively rare. It's not the pattern that the economy manages to rise from very low levels of income, as the case of China, to such high rates in recent years, or Korea, for example. Some countries are managing to grow relatively rapidly, but others no. Look at Argentina, for example. Argentina used to be the 6th richest country in the world a century ago, and now it's pretty middling. So it's not nearly as well up as it used to be. More on this probably when we discuss Argentina and other countries. Argentina is an interesting case, and it may actually experience some upheavals in the coming years. All right. So let's go to let's very quickly. We're running out of time. Let me just say a few words about Japan and then finish. This is economic growth in Japan, and unfortunately, in the case of Japan, we've had negative growth in the past year. That's not good news. And what's the source of this? It seems that goods and services exports has been growing, so this is not the culprit. To some extent, private consumption has gone down. That is a problem. But investment also and business expenditure has gone down sharply, and that's the key to the decline in GDP in Japan. Now, how did we get here? Oh, before doing that, let me also mention inflation in Japan. Japan is sort of a unique country in some ways. In the past few decades, it has been experiencing a lot of deflation. See, this is the zero line. And many years, it has experienced deflation. Overall prices right now, or until recently, prices were lower than they had been 20, 30 years ago. And so deflation has been a big problem. And when you have deflation in the country, you have a difficulty. You face a difficulty because people don't spend a whole lot. They get the cash, and if they just hold on to it, don't do anything, just keep the cash in your bank account or put it in the bank account, the real value of that cash goes up. So people are in no rush to buy things. And as a result, demand goes down. And when demand goes down, incomes go down. Indirectly, it comes back to the household. Household is holding on to its cash and is seeing its income shrink and prices go down. So they actually become more entrenched in keeping cash, not spending, being cautious with spending, and creating less demand for their fellow citizens. And as a result, the economy could stagnate long term. And that's one of the problems with economic growth in China, in Japan being so low. If you look at economic growth over the past decade, as you can see here, it was pretty much around zero. There was a bit of up and down, but overall economic growth in Japan has been pretty disappointing since late 1980s, well over 30 years. Okay, so now what happened recently, COVID-19 brought about some inflation. The two peaks in short and small peaks in inflation in the past, these are artificially created by the government. The government actually increased consumption taxes, it increased sales taxes in order to push up prices and sort of get the economy out of that deflationary mode. But it didn't work because once prices jumped up, people were cautious. They actually cut back on the real expenditure, so the economy experienced recession rather than experiencing a movement out of deflation. Recently, there's been a major change. For the first time in decades, inflation reached about 4%, and it's been around 3% right now, which is above the 2% target of the central bank. Now, what problems does this cause for them? Let's see. Let me go back to where does this come from? The development strategy was export promotion years ago. They used a wide range of policies from controlling finance, regulation, infrastructure to favor export industries. And other industries were kind of neglected. They were, especially the local economy, the part that is not engaged in exports and imports. That part of the economy was sort of managed like a socialist economy to maintain social harmony in Japan and maintain support for export industries. That was their strategy, to promote exports. Then diminishing returns to investment and exports that we've discussed in case of China. The same thing happened in Japan, but a few decades earlier. And in fact, Chinese learned some lessons from them, tried to modify the strategy to make sure it works better for them. But the low investment that Chinese had in non-tradables, because Chinese have put all their finances into export promotion, or most of it. As a result, local development was weak compared to China, and that led to real exchange rate increases. Cost of production in Japan went up in the 1980s, and that led to a crash in the stock market. House prices had gone, price of land, housing, labor, etc., had gone up, and eventually the economy hit a wall in 1990, and then the stock market crashed, property prices went down. But the government tried to keep the property price, tried to keep employment high and keep businesses from leaving Japan despite increasing in costs. So they tried to use their control over finances to lend to businesses at very favorable terms. So let's see what impact it had. This is private consumption in Japan, which is about recently is about 54% or so, but it has always been between 50 and 60%. So it's somewhere in between the US and China in terms of consumption share. Investment used to be pretty high, like China. It was about 40% in the 1960s, but it has gradually gone down, and recently it's been pretty flat at about 25% of GDP, which is still pretty good, but not what it used to be. And exports have gone up, but if you look at net exports, they've been flat. Government expenditure has gone up since 1990. The government has used its expenditure as a mechanism to increase economic growth. And in order to do that, they had been running huge deficits. The result is that government of Japan has the highest debt GDP ratio in the world, about 250% plus. Consumers, as I mentioned, have been concerned about deflation and the economy not growing, so they have not been spending a whole lot, and as a result, consumption has stagnated or gone down, and the government has been forced to continue increasing its expenditure or maintaining its expenditure, despite the fact that it has huge debt and huge deficits. So reforming Japan in order to sort of change the situation has been very slow, because they were worried about disrupting social harmony. Remember, the whole strategy was built on this social harmony idea decades ago, after World War II. The government's effort to maintain exports and employment in those firms proved costly, because they lent to the companies that had huge costs and were very costly, and that led to also public debt going up. The real exchange rate has remained high, and exports have remained relatively weak as a result of that. I've discussed the reason why households have remained cautious. They don't see a whole lot of growth. They see prices going down, and they see their incomes not growing or going down. And that concern has prevented the private consumption from taking off. Deflation has become entrenched and has exacerbated the problem. And the governments, as I also mentioned, that they had tried to increase taxes in order to artificially create inflation, but that was a one-off increase in prices, did not really help get that country out of deflationary mode. Now, COVID-19 created another opportunity for inflation to go up, because the government, like many other countries, they increased money supply, they tried to increase government expenditure, and inflation has gone above target. So they're thinking to control inflation before it gets out of hand. So central bank has said that it's going to raise interest rates. This is, again, might actually reduce investment with higher interest rates, and net exports and consumption. Net exports might go down, because if they raise interest rates, then the value of yen goes up, and that makes it more costly to export. So now the last slide. In the US, interest rates have gone up, and that has forced the Central Bank of Japan to compete, because if the increase in US interest rates mean that the dollar becomes more expensive, meaning that yen becomes cheaper. And that goes counter to what the Central Bank of Japan wants to do. Now, in the middle of this, if interest rates go up in Japan, the government may not be able to finance its debt. Its debt is huge. The numbers are not exact. It's definitely well over 200%. And if right now their interest rate is zero, or in some cases a bit negative, if the government of Japan has to pay 3-4%, just think about, assume that they have to pay 3% interest of 200% of GDP, 3% interest. That means that their deficit due to interest that they have to pay is going to be 6% just automatically, probably a lot more, even without increasing their expenditure. So this is a huge problem, and servicing that debt with that high interest rate is a major problem. Okay. Another fiscal crisis, maybe maybe waiting for Japanese government. Okay, let me finish my discussion here and see if you have any questions. Sorry, it went way over time.
Professor, would a country like Japan, being an island country and that's seeing a reduction in population growth, wouldn't easing immigration policy and increasing tariffs help with like both problems?
Well, immigration can help, but Japan is not US or Canada. They have really hard time accepting foreigners into their society, integrating them. There's been much more immigration in recent years compared to the past, especially because the population is aging very rapidly, and this issue of dependency ratio is huge. So maybe they have to do this, but they try to avoid it as much as possible because Japanese culture and history does not quite accept immigrants the way, for example, Canada does. It's not an immigrant society.
Yeah, I actually echo that because I have heard that immigration has been very, very difficult. And then recently it just started to loosen up a little, but still, it's just not a very open society. Professor Hardy, thank you very much for sharing that information about Japan because my understanding is kind of totally opposite. Because recently there's so much talk about Japan being stronger, the equity market has been encouraged by the government, things like that. And then yen has reached the new low, like 150. I don't know. That's what I knew a few days ago. I don't know about now.
Right.
And then
yeah,
the real estate
due to U.S. interest rates going up, right?
Yeah, and real estate has reached a new high. There's a lot of real estate funds I have heard, like making a lot of investments. They are doing business, building buildings, things like that. And then famously, of course, Warren Buffett was talking about investing in the equity market there. So it's like there's a huge new idea about going to Japan for equity growth. So you really bring in a very different perspective. I really need
Well,
to like rethink.
You're making a very good point, and I don't want to sound negative and too sound negative on Japan. I just wanted to say that there's some
Yeah. No. It's great.
caution,
It's good to know.
but in terms of potential of Japan, if they can implement some reforms, and especially if they can solve the long-term population problem by immigration, maybe robots can do it.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting point. It's like Japan, where they're gonna go and what they're gonna do in terms of their industry, right? They have this cutting edge leading whatever thing in their automotive industry,
Right.
right. And then now we got Tesla and then China's, hybrid or EVs really crushing the world, things like that. So what's gonna be left for Japan to do, right? So I don't know. I'm also curious about what they're gonna do.
There are points of strength, but there are also points of weakness, and this issue of the exchange rate, which is causing difficulty, and interest rate. This is again comes from that debt overhang largely. If the government did not have that kind of huge debt, raising interest rates would not have been a big deal, and would have actually helped a lot in case of Japan, because a lot of elderly depend on return on their fixed income assets, so they bought bonds. and it
Mhm.
doesn't give them any interest. So they really have to sell their assets for their expenditures during retirement. And if the interest rate was a bit higher, that interest rate could pay for a lot more expenditure by the elderly, and as a result,
Mhm.
consumption demand could be higher.
Mhm. Interesting. And just one quick suggestion. Can we talk about Singapore in the future? I find that place
Sure. So
fascinating.
that's a fascinating case, and
Yeah.
especially now, some businesses out of China are moving to Singapore. That makes
Yeah. Everybody's there
sense.
now.
Right. It makes sense to take a look.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank
Thank you
you.
for the suggestion.
when Nvidia reported their earnings in this quarter, right, 2 weeks back, I think, or I think after the US, the kind of their chips that any country that has bought was Singapore. All of a sudden, it picked up, and people are still discussing that how come Singapore is buying so many Nvidia chips. We'll see what happens. But
That's
if I may
very good
quickly
point.
add one more point is, because I did a Japan immersion capstone, 2 months back, and we had some speakers from Japan, and we had the discussion around the economy. One thing that came up, actually, that was my take-home message, as Vivian was asking what next for Japan. What they are saying is that Japan is kind of now promoting more entrepreneurship, because they realize that so far they've been really good with electronics and something very niche, but they have never promoted the kind of broader and diverse entrepreneurship, right? So one thing, their experts and some of the people they were brought in from Japan actually on the to talk to us, where the entrepreneurship is going to be one of the critical, let's say, supporting things for the government as well. So they could expand a little bit kind of wider rather than being in the electronics or that industry. So just wanted to add that to Vivian, but looking forward to learning more. Professor Heidi, this was a very insightful session, I can tell
Yeah.
you that.
Rich.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Very helpful. Thank you, Professor Hardy. Always, always. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And hopefully we're going to be seeing you soon again. And also suggestions for other topics would be much appreciated.
Yeah.
We want to
Anyone
make
who's in the
sure-
Bay Area, we're gonna meet next Saturday or Sunday. Saturday, Professor Hardy. We'll look forward to seeing you and your wife.
Sure, sure. My wife may not be able to make it, but
Uh-huh.
because something has come up with her mother that she needs to attend.
Oh.
But we'll know in a couple of days.
Okay. Okay. I hope everything is okay.
But I will be attending anyway.
Okay. Great. Great. All right. I will, give you a little bit more details
Thank you.
in the next few days. Okay.
Thank
Great. Thank
you
you,
all
guys.
for joining us. Thank you.
Bye.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so where are we meeting? I'm in the Bay Area. I didn't hear about this.
Hey, yeah. Why don't you? How can I pass the information to you? Will you be able to text me or something like that? Sorry, is it on Anna?
Yes,
Is that right?
yes, correct.
Okay.
I understand the professor is also going to be here. I don't want to miss.
Right.
Okay.
You can find our information in Workplace.
In Workplace.
Yeah, MBA Bay Area, iDegrees Bay Area group. So
yes,
forward to having you.
I'm there too, but there are so many messages that I'm not following. But now I'll go back and catch up.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.